How many of you in this room this past week were robbed? Someone robbed you. How many? And I'm talking about the prices at the grocery store. I want to know how many of you were actually robbed. Was anybody robbed this week? I see a hand. Anybody get robbed? You got robbed. What happened this week? What'd they steal? Furniture. Someone stole your furniture? I've seen that ratty old stuff. They did you a favor. No. I'm kidding you, obviously. Well, this morning, my message is entitled, Thanks for Nothing. Now, this isn't going to be your typical Thanksgiving message, and I know some of you are thinking, thanks for nothing. Well, let me tell you where I'm going with that. Maybe some of you will remember a number of years ago, there was a Simpsons cartoon Thanksgiving special, and Homer asked Bart to say grace on Thanksgiving. And this is his prayer. He says, Dear Lord, we paid for all of this stuff ourselves, so thanks for nothing. Now, some of you find that funny. Most of you find that offensive. But you know what I think? I think it's a great commentary on what's wrong with today's society and what's really wrong with Thanksgiving. We have a lot of people in Canada where Thanksgiving is just another day off. It's just another paid holiday like Labor Day or Victoria Day, and they're not sure what they're about either. I mean, at least at Christmas and Easter, as much as they've been commercialized and taken off in a different direction, people have a vague recollection that they're still about the birth and subsequently the resurrection of Christ. When it comes to Thanksgiving, I think people have completely, totally, utterly lost the meaning. It's like this farmer, he'd bought this farm. The farm was run down, it was beat up, and it was just a mess. The barn was falling down, and the fences were falling down, and everything needed painting. There was weeds everywhere. He buys this farm. He spends the next 3 or 4 months sprucing it up, straightening the barn, painting the barn, fixing the fences, mowing the grass, killing the weeds. Finally, after about 4 months, it's looking immaculate, and the local pastor comes by to pay him a visit. And he walks into the yard, and he says to the farmer, my goodness, what a beautiful farm the Lord has given you. And the farmer says, well, I guess, but you should have seen it when he had it by himself. And I think that's really emblematic of what many of us are like. We take credit for things that God has done in our lives, and we don't realize how amazing our God is. Sometimes it's good to give thanks for nothing. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 points, all related to this, and the first one is this. Point number 1 is this, that nothing is sometimes better than something. Number 2, that there's almost always something, even when it looks like nothing. And number 3, anything is possible when you give thanks for nothing. All right, you following this? So let's look at this first one. Is that nothing is sometimes better than something. You know, I get calls from people, letters mostly and emails from people, viewers, and they complain about their lot in life. And they say they prayed and they prayed and they prayed and they prayed and nothing happened and God overlooked their just claim and they're mad because they got nothing, nada, zippo, zilch, the big goose egg from heaven. And they're all upset about how God gave them nothing. And I'm always a little bit amazed by that because sometimes they're missing the big picture. I think we all are. Do we get every prayer answered exactly the way we prayed it? No, not in my experience. But I know that God knows best and that He has a plan in it all. Because sometimes, and this is what I'm going to try to convince you today, sometimes nothing is better than something. There was a great theologian, many of you have heard of him, his name is Matthew Henry. He wrote a commentary on the entire Bible, very famous commentator and preacher. And one day he was robbed by thieves. And of course at first he was upset that he was robbed. But then he realized that there was huge blessings in being robbed. And he listed them, and this is what he said. He said, I give thanks to God because though I was robbed, I have never been robbed before. And then he says, I give thanks to God because even though they took my wallet, they did not take my life. And then he said, I give thanks to God because even though they took my all, it wasn't much. And then finally he said, I give thanks to God because it was I who was robbed and not I who was doing the robbing. And you see, what he did was he looked to the fact that even though something bad had happened, there could have been a whole lot worse. And so sometimes nothing is better than something. Here's where I'm going with this. Skill testing question for you. How many of you in this room this past week were robbed? Someone robbed you. How many? And I'm talking about the prices at the grocery store. I want to know how many of you were actually robbed. Was anybody robbed this week? I see a hand. Anybody get robbed? You got robbed. What happened this week? What'd they steal? Furniture. Someone stole your furniture? I've seen that ratty old stuff. They did you a favor. No. I'm kidding you, obviously. Anybody else get robbed this week? He lost some furniture. Anybody else get robbed? Anybody else? Is that the only hand? Okay, let me ask the question another way. How many of you did not get robbed this week? You know what, folks? Every hand should be up except for the one, right? Are you doing the math here? You either got robbed or you didn't get robbed. How many did not get robbed this week? Oh, every last one of you except for that one did not get robbed. Okay, here's where I'm going with this. How many of you think not getting robbed was better than getting robbed? So in other words, nothing was better than something. Are you following this? And we need to begin to look at the big picture that sometimes nothing is better than something, but we get so caught up in the somethings and the small things that we miss the big picture, that God is taking care of us every single day, that God is sovereign, that God in His providential wisdom is always taking care of us. You know, we should wake up every morning and we should be so excited when we have the breath in our lungs. Because you know what that means? It means you're not dead. You should be excited every single day because of what is not happening. You're not broke. You're not sick. You're not in crisis. You're not in jail. You're not dead. We should wake up and we should go, woohoo, another day. I'm still here. Why is it that we don't get excited about the small stuff? The nothings are worth praising God for every single day. Like this guy who woke up one morning and he began his prayers for the morning. And he said, God, so far I've had a pretty good day. I haven't been angry. I haven't been bitter. I haven't been frustrated. I haven't lost my temper. But in a few moments' time, I'm going to set my foot out of bed. And from then on, I'm going to need a whole lot more help. And the reality is that many of us overlook the blessings of God that are there every single day. The Lady Elgin was a steamship on the Lake Michigan. And on a night in September in 1860, it collided with a schooner and it went down in the water. There was 307 passengers on that steamship. 279 of them perished in the cold waters. There was a university student. He was standing on the bank and he saw the whole thing. He saw people falling into the water and floundering and drowning. He dove into the water, he swam out to where the steamship was, and he hauled back a person. He swam back and hauled back a second person, and then a third, and then a fourth, and he hauled back all by himself 17 people. Of the 28 people, Edward Spencer had saved 17 of their lives. After he dragged the 17th person, he was completely, utterly exhausted, and he could not go back for any more. He collapsed on the beach. They came and they took him off, and they realized that the cold waters of spending that much time in those waters had ended up doing nerve damage in his back, and he was paralyzed from the waist down, spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. On his 80th birthday, 60 years after the disaster, they decided to do a newspaper story on Edward Spencer. They went to see this old man who was there, who had saved these 17 people. And they said, what is your most vivid memory of what happened that evening 60 years ago? He said, my most vivid memory is this, that out of the 17 people that I saved their lives, not one ever came back to thank me. That's a great tragedy, that these people went on with their lives. They had a life, all because of Edward Spencer. Spencer lost his quality of life for the rest of his existence, and no one ever thanked him for it. You see, what I'm trying to get across to us is that whether we like it or not, human nature is not naturally grateful. It is learned behavior. When you were growing up, if you're my age, when you were growing up, you will remember our parents used to drive gratitude in us. If you would ask for something, they always say, now, what do you say? And what do you say? Please. And then you get it, and they'd say, now, what do you say? Thank you. And they drove into us the concept of please and thank you, because it does not come naturally. We have to be learned this. Do you remember when you came into this world? No, none of you remember that. But I think you will remember what you did. What was the first thing you did when you came into this world? You cried. How come? How come you cried? Because you were cold, because you were wet. You were cold and wet, so you cried. And then you were hungry and you cried. And then you were tired and then you cried. And then you were poopy and you cried. And then your parents kicked you out of the house at 39 and you cried. Gratitude is not natural. Gratitude is learned behavior, and if we don't drill it into our children, they will not be grateful. We were sitting in a restaurant one day, and there was this couple sitting at the next table, and they had a little girl with them, maybe about 7 years old, and they turned to the little girl, they were looking at the menu, and they said to the little girl, "Would you like a Shirley Temple?" Shirley Temple is like about what, $4 in a restaurant. And they said, "Would you like a Shirley Temple?" You know what she said? "If I have to." And I'm thinking, if I have to, if you were sitting at my table, you'd be getting a glass of lukewarm water, no ice. That's what you'd be getting. No ice just to punish you for your attitude. But you see, the reality is this, is that we are not naturally grateful. And here's the problem. Ungrateful children grow into ungrateful adults. I'm concerned about the next generation. Not because they're bratty little kids. Well, they are bratty little kids, but they're bratty little kids because the parents haven't taught them that gratitude is one of the greatest things that we have as far as our social network and as far as communicating with one another. Gratitude is really one of those things that makes the world go around. So the first thing that I want to impress upon you is sometimes nothing is better than something. But the second thing is this. There's almost always a something even when it looks like nothing. And even when it looks like nothing's happening, there's almost always something going on there. If we will look beyond the obvious, there's almost always something happening in the midst of it. There's a great story that happened a few years ago in Mozambique. There was a terrible flash flood in this particular village, and the flood came through, the waters came up right up to the rooftops and flooded the entire village. There was all kinds of people killed, and the homes were destroyed, and the livestock was destroyed. 17 people managed to get up into the tops of trees. And they were sitting in the trees, and one of the men that was up there was the pastor of the town, and his name was Samuel Naftal. And he was up there, and he was encouraging the people. He said, just keep on holding on, help will come. And he said, hold on, hold on, hold on, because he knew with the waters going by, there was bodies floating by, and cows and furniture floating by, and if they fell into the raging waters, they were done. And so he was just encouraging him, you got to hold on, don't fall into the waters. Well, when nighttime came, he realized he was in trouble, because if they fell asleep, they were going to fall in the water. And so he started preaching to them to keep them awake. And then that wasn't working very well. So he began to pray, and he said, God, you need to save us. You need to save us, or we're going to fall in these waters and we're all going to perish. And so that went all that night. But what happened that night was the mosquitoes came out. Right after a flood, and the mosquitoes came out. All night long, the mosquitoes were biting and biting and biting and biting. The next day came along, they were still awake. He kept on preaching to them. The next night came, the mosquitoes came out again, bit them, just swarming all night, just absolutely driving them crazy. Finally, on the third day, after they'd been there for a full 48 hours in the trees, the waters finally subsided enough that they were able to come from the trees, and all 17 were safe. A newspaper reporter came to do a story on this, and asked them this question. They said, well, we don't understand. A bit of a skeptic. They said, there you were praying, and you were asking God to spare you from the waters, but God never spared you, and you had to wait till the flood's waters were done. And he says, oh, you don't understand. He says, God did spare us. He says, because he sent mosquitoes, and they bit us so much that we couldn't fall asleep. And that's what saved our life, because goodness knows my preaching wasn't keeping them awake. And the point of this is that if we look hard enough, you can always see that there is something even when it looks like nothing. And in fact, a lot of times there's something big that's happening in the midst of it. You know, every year the UN does an assessment of all the nations in the world. And they call it the Human Development Index. And really what it is basically quality of life. And they rate all the nations of the world. And typically you'll have nations like Sierra Leone right at the absolute bottom. And you know who's almost always at the top? Canada. Canada has won the Human Development Index by the UN more years than any other country. Canada really is one of the most blessed places in the world to live. And yet we just take it for granted. We have people that are complaining because they're hard done by. You know, I look at people and I think, we have nothing to complain about. I don't believe there's anybody in this room Maybe nobody in our country that has a right to complain about their finances. If people are on welfare in Canada, they are amongst the richest people in the whole world. That's just the reality. No one has a right to complain in our country. Let me ask you a question, because I know I'm not going to ask how many of you have complained about your finances, because that would be everybody. But let me ask the question this way. How many of you own a house? You have a house, maybe you have a mortgage, that's not a problem, but how many of you own a house? How many of you own a house in this room? Wow. Wow, you know what? You're richer than 95% of the world's population. Only 5% of the world owns their own house. Let me ask the second question. This is going to be really telling. How many of you own the house and a car? How many of you own a house and a car? Let me say, woo! Look at you people. You are richer than 99% of the world's population. You are amongst the richest 1% in the entire world, most of you in this room. I'm not even going to ask you how many of you own 2 cars. You people are just filthy rich. I don't even want to talk to you. Or 3 or 4. It goes on and on and on, doesn't it? You know, it's amazing when we look at what we have and we just take it for granted. We just take what God has done in our lives for granted. It's really quite remarkable. You know, there's a surefire cure for this. You know what it is? Short-term mission trip. I think a short-term mission trip is a surefire cure. You say, how is that surefire? Well, when we send people to the third world, it changes their attitude about how they live in this nation. And let me ask you, how many, I'm asking questions here, trying to get a poll head count. How many of you have been on a short-term mission trip to the third world or long-term? How many? Look at all those hands. Okay, keep them up, keep them up. Been to a short-term trip somewhere in the world, third world. Now let me ask you this, hold them right up so we can see them. Now, how many of you felt like it changed your perspective on life in North America? Oh, the same hands. No, not one hand went down. You see, you can put them down. When you go on a short-term mission trip, it changes you. Here's the news, folks. If we send you off for a week to Mexico, do we honestly think you're going to change Mexico? Mexico's never be the same after Jimmy went there in 2007. I doubt it. You know, is it a good thing for Mexico? Sure. Glad you went. Didn't hurt. Well, it might have. But for the most part, it didn't hurt. It was a good thing. It made a contribution to missions. But there's something far more significant that happens in you. And it's what happens in you that really changes you. People come back, and this is what they do. They come back, and all of a sudden, they have a heart for missions. They have a heart for the other nations. All of a sudden, they have a compassion for the poor that they didn't have before. And they begin to take on sponsor childs, and they begin to help others around them. They begin to look at their own life, and they realize, I have got everything. They begin to recognize how good we have it. See, I got news for you. You know, even if you're an immigrant to this country, you really have nothing to do with the abundance in this land. I was born here. Did I have anything to do with that? No, I had nothing to do with that. I could have just as easily been born in Mexico as here. Is that true? Sure. How do I know where I was going to be born? You know, I popped out of the womb and I looked around and went, whoo, Canada, cool. It could have been Mexico. You know, a few years ago, Kathy and I were in South America, and we were in this little shop. And when we were in this little shop, Kathy found something she wanted to buy, and so I gave the lady my credit card, and she looked at the credit card, and she looked at me, and she looked at the credit card, and she looked at me, and I thought, is there something wrong with my card? And then she said, you have the same last name as I do. And I went, really? She says, yeah, my name is Anna Hughes, and your name is Mark Hughes. We have the same last name. So we began to talk, and as we talked, we realized that both of our ancestors had come from Wales. Hughes is a Welsh name. Our ancestors way back when came from Wales. Somehow or another, my ancestors came to Canada. Her ancestors went to South America. Probably, if you go back, maybe, we were related at some point. Maybe somewhere through our ancestry line, we were related. So you know what that means? I could have just as easily been born in South America as in North America. I didn't have any say in the matter, did I? I just got this blessing just because. And I remember when that happened with the credit card thinking, I could have been born in any of these places. I know the color of my skin sort of belies a little bit, but for the most part, it's true. I could have been anywhere. Immigrants went everywhere in the world. We could be in South America. We could be in India. We could be in Mexico. Who knows where we could have been born? We didn't have anything to do with it. And even if you immigrated to Canada, good for you. It still isn't this nation that it is because of something you've done. You know the whole world wants to come here, don't you? I mean, when I go to Mexico and I see these dirt poor people that are living literally in cardboard boxes or tin shacks with dirt floors, and when I look at them, I never once get to that place where I think I am better than them, because I am not better than them. You are not better than them. They didn't choose that lifestyle. They were born into that lifestyle, and it's got nothing to do whether they were good people or bad people or anything else. It just is the way it played out. Every time I see that, I'm so grateful. I thought, I will not act like I am better than these people. I will not act like I have an entitlement somehow because I'm from North America and they're from Central America. It changes your perspective. And we realize that we really are living in the promised land. It's like the story of Maria. Maria, every day, she tries to get across the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is not, it's not some huge raging river. Have you seen the Rio Grande? It's like a foot deep. You can walk across it. The reason you can't get across it is there's border patrol everywhere and they won't let you. And so anyway, Maria tries to get across every day from Mexico into the U.S. to come and live the American dream. And every day the guards turn her back and she goes back to Mexico. One day she shows up and they go, Maria, Maria, are you going to do this every day? Are you going to show up here every day and try to get across? She goes, see. And they say, well, Maria, you can't survive in North America. You can't survive here. You can't even speak English. She says, no problema. And they said, no. They said, look, Maria, here's the deal. If you could say one sentence using 3 English words and you can do it correctly, we'll let you in. And the 3 English words are this. They're green, they're pink, and they're yellow. She goes, see. She goes, the phone go green, green. I pink it up, say, yellow. You know, last week I said we were in Saskatchewan and it was interesting. I ran into a man that I'd met before and I recognized him immediately because about 3 years ago, he's kind of a biker dude and he jumped on his Harley and he drove to Winnipeg and he came to one of our services. It was in June. And after the service, we had a church picnic, and I invited him to come to the church picnic. Some of you will remember, because we were out there all in our shorts and T-shirts playing soccer, and there was this guy in black leather pants and a black leather vest and big boots and tattoos playing soccer with us. Some of you remember that. And this guy had come from Regina. And so anyway, what happens is, I remember that 3 years ago, and last week I'm in Regina, and having a meeting, and the guy comes up, and I immediately recognize him. He's wearing the same black leathers that he plays soccer in. And so he came up, and he introduced himself. He said, do you remember me? And I said, yeah, you're the soccer player. And so we started talking, and then anyway, I could see there wasn't something right. And I said, something looks like it's bothering you. He says, well, we had a really bad week. I said, well, tell me about your week. He says, well, my son just bought himself a new bike. Bought himself a 2010 Harley Wide Glide. And he says he was out riding, and he was going through a green light, and a lady made a left turn right into him, hit him in the leg, and severed his leg from the knee down. And then, you could see he was visibly upset about it. And then he said, but I'm just so grateful that my son is still alive. He says he's in good spirits, and he's going to have to get a prosthesis on his leg and all of that. But he says, I'm just so grateful that my son is still with us, because I realized in that moment we could have lost him. I realized in that moment he could have just as easily been killed, but he wasn't killed. And I know that my son is going to survive. And though this isn't great, he says, I'm just so grateful for God. And I thought, what an amazing attitude. In the midst of this tragedy where most of us would become completely undone, where most of us would be whining and saying, where was God? Where was God? Where was God? This guy saw where God was. That even in the midst of his tragedy, he saw a blessing that his son was still alive. And you see, there's always something, even when it looks like there is nothing. So first thing I wanted you to see was this, that sometimes nothing is better than something. But secondly, there's almost always something, even when there looks like nothing. And the third thing is this, anything is possible when you give thanks for nothing. Now, let me tell you about the first American Thanksgiving. Most of us, when we think of the first American Thanksgiving, I know what you visualize. You think of broad-rimmed hats. You think of a bunch of pilgrims sitting around eating corn on the cob and pumpkin pie and a huge big wild turkey and all the trimmings and just eating till they can't move anymore. But if that's your image of the first Thanksgiving, you have got it all wrong. Because let me tell you the story. They arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620. After the first year in 1621, of the 102 colonists, 51 of them have died of starvation. There was only half of them left. And there they were struggling, they had had almost complete crop failure, and the governor of the Plymouth colony was a man by the name of William Bradford. And he decided that he was going to gather together all of the colony, and they were going to have a Thanksgiving anyway, even though they had the terrible year. And he said, let us gather all young and old, and let's give God praise for his goodness to us. Now I want you to think about it. They were giving God thanks for nothing because that's what they had. Their ration for that winter was 5 kernels of corn per person per day. That's not very much food. And so they gave God thanks for what little they had. Even in the midst of nothing, they gave God thanks. Now here's where the story is really fascinating, because God knew they were coming. And God prepared a way, and God had a plan. And this is what happened. About 10 or 12 years earlier, there was an explorer came by the name of John Smith. Most of you know that name from another Disney story called Pocahontas. Another mixed up, confused story that does nothing to do with true history. But what had happened was one of John Smith's men had kidnapped a native Indian by the name of Squanto. And he kidnapped him, and he took him as a prisoner, and he took him back to Spain, and he was going to make him a slave in Spain. What ended up happening was he met up with some Christian friars who actually kind of helped him escape. And what they did was they introduced him to Christianity. In order to sort of spare his life and existence, they managed to get him off to England, and he spent the next 8 or 10 years in England. While he was in England, Squanto learned English. He learned the European culture and all kinds of things like this. Eventually, they allowed him to go home. They sent him on a ship, and he got back to his homeland. When he got back to the new land and he went to the place where his tribe was, his entire tribe had been wiped out by an epidemic. They were gone, every last one of them. He was the only one left. But here's where the story gets fascinating. The Plymouth colony had set up camp, and they built their colony on the exact spot in which his tribe used to live. And so what he did was he befriended the colonists, and he befriended in particular William Bradford. Now what had happened when they had already struggled through their first year? They were dying, they were starving, they were failing miserably, and Squanto taught them how to survive in the harshness of the new land. And he taught them how to grow corn, and he taught them how to exist, and he taught them how to hunt, because this was a different world than they were used to back in Europe. And after the next year, this colony that was really on its last legs, it almost failed, had turned around and became a prosperous and flourishing colony under William Bradford and under Squanto, their good friend. 2 years later, Squanto became ill, and he died. As he was lying on his deathbed, William Bradford praised him, and later he wrote this. He said that Squanto was a special instrument sent of God, for without him we would have all perished. It's amazing to think of the entire American colonies began in this moment. It was a sort of a Joseph moment, how there was someone sent ahead, a prisoner like Joseph named Squanto, and it was he that saved the day. And God foresaw it years before. Obviously, he sees everything. And he made a way where there was no way. And even though William Bradford led the people to give thanks for nothing, there was something in the midst of nothing, and God had a plan, and God had a way, and their lives were all spared because of Squanto. As Squanto lay on his deathbed, he turned up to William Bradford, and he said, please pray for me that I might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. And Squanto gave his heart to Christ on his deathbed, and so the story goes that he found eternal life. You see, it's a remarkable redemptive story about how God has everything in hand. He's got a plan. When there seems like there's no way, God has a way. When it seems like there is no hope, there is always hope. Because God is there. He's for us, not against us. He is providence. In his providence, he's always making a way. That's why we need to remember to give thanks to God even for nothing. And remember, sometimes nothing is better than something. And there's always something even when it looks like nothing. And anything can happen when you give thanks for nothing. So today, let's remember to give him thanks. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. To purchase an audio, video, or DVD copy of this or any other program, please call Church of the Rock at 1-877-700-ROCK. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.